Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Beyond JMS. I'm Temple Northup. I'm the director of the School of Journalism and Media Studies here at SDSU, and I'm excited to have you joining us today as we talk with our guest, Gingko PR founder and CEO, Cher Hale. For those joining the first time, our Beyond JMS events are a platform for professionals to share valuable tips and insights about careers in media and skills you may need to succeed. We hold them here live on Fridays on Zoom, and then we post them to YouTube. So there are lots of ways to catch these. Before we begin, I'd like to take a brief moment for a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of a given geographic area and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their ancestral territories. For San Diego State, we recognize the land as Kumeyaay. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been part of this land. The land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. So I am super excited about our guest today, Cher Hale. Cher is the founder and director of Gingko PR, a boutique agency that believes in using PR to help historically excluded authors and entrepreneurs take back their narratives. As a Taiwanese-Black American woman, Cher is passionate about leveraging the power of media to tell diverse stories through online, print, TV, and podcast mediums so that she can play a role in reshaping how our society views social justice, feminism, and multiculturalism. So thank you very much, Cher, for joining us today.
I'm so glad to be here.
And I have a funny story about how I met Cher, how I got connected with Cher, which of course relates to the Italian language. For anyone who knows me, they know I love Italian, I love Italy. And so I'm constantly looking for podcasts focused on the Italian language. And I came across one that was really awesome. There was this American woman who's talking about Italian language. And so eventually I Google her. It's Cher, and that's what I discovered. Not only has she had this amazing podcast, but she has this amazing PR agency. And so I thought, well, I've got to invite her to come speak to the school because it's just really cool. And so that's where I want to start. I want to start with Ginkgo PR. So can you tell us a bit about the agency and its vision and your vision for what it does?
Yeah, I think I'll start with saying this agency was not always what it is today. So when I first started working in PR, I just pitched podcasts for some clients on a freelance basis. And it was mostly the same kind of client, Temple. It was your upper middle class white life coach who was a woman. And her story was pretty standard within my industry, at least, where it was, I was unhappy, so I hired a life coach. And then it helped me, so I became one. And I want to help you too. And while that story is valid in so many different ways, it was no longer interesting to me as a publicist because you're so intimate with your client's background and your stories. And so you really have to be invested personally in what they're offering to the world, because that's what makes a great publicist versus just a good one, right? So I knew I needed a new direction, but wasn't sure exactly what that looked like. And then unfortunately, my mother passed away early at the age of 49. And she was an immigrant from Taiwan who in her 40s, alongside me, discovered a passion for Italy and the Italian language. And she decided that she was going to write this beautiful trilogy of novels set in Tuscany with her unique lens as an immigrant, a mother, and a woman of color. Unfortunately, she never published those novels, right? And after her passing, I kept thinking, man, not only does it suck that she couldn't see her dream come to life in this way, but also I have this skill set, right? I had this skill set to help her take her message and share it with others who need it most, who could benefit from it. And why wasn't I doing that then? You know, what stopped me? And more importantly, what stopped her? What systemic barriers got in her way from being able to say, I want to do this and being able to do it? And so obviously this large moment brought an existential crisis for me, and I really had to stop and assess my life. I live in Spokane, Washington. Buongiorno. I live in Spokane, Washington, which is a very white dominant area. And a lot of my friends were white. And so I had to first look at my personal networks and increase diversity there before I decided to increase diversity within my business. And then it became very clear to me that for those who have been excluded from the media, people have been telling their stories for them. But I could use PR, which is used a lot of the times for, I would say, like the shadow side of PR is to use it to tell lies and to tell false narratives, but I could use it for good, right? I could use it to take back those stories so that these people can tell it with their own voices. And so we can influence the future of media where it's more equitable, where we have an influence of positive stereotypes instead, right? Where we use this media as a force for good, as a mechanism for social change.
That's such a great story, and interesting, just the influence of your mom and her passing away and how it really changed the trajectory of your career. So as you're having this awakening or whatever, you mentioned some of the steps to sort of shift what you were working on. Can you talk a little bit more about how you went, how you got to the space where you are today? Like, how did you go about shifting your message? Because in a sense, you're doing PR for others, but as an agency owner and founder, like you have to do PR for yourself so that people know what you're doing. So how did you shift into the space where now it's very front and center on your website? This is what you're doing. You're telling these stories of marginalized communities.
Yeah, I would say for anybody who has the desire to run their own business or to do freelance within the communications industry, there is a certain level of visibility that you have to become comfortable having yourself. So first, I had a lot of visibility hangups, right? It was hard for me to be on video, hard for me to use my voice, hard for me to communicate in a way that was compelling and comprehensive and cohesive. And so I really had to sit and figure out, what do I stand for first, right? What are my values? What's my ethos? And when someone comes to me with a question about how I pitch or who I serve, am I able to communicate that clearly? And once I got all of the foundation set up, I was able to say, okay, now I can, with confidence, put on my homepage that this is who we serve and this is only who we serve, right? And when people come to me and they say, hey, I'm not your ideal client, but I have this message, would you work with me? I'm able to give them a very clear reason for why we're not a fit. And so there was a lot of boundary management, I would say, as one of the first skills I had to learn and relearn all the time to help integrate what I was saying I do with what I was actually doing, right? To help me walk my talk. And then had to consistently re-deliver that message and re-educate people about who I was and what I stood for in mediums like this and on podcasts, right? Publications. You have to just consistently say your core messages over and over and over again so people know this is what you stand for and this is what you do.
Yeah, and so I imagine in some ways, perhaps it was a little like almost scary to like make this transition, because you're going in on a very specific vision for what you are. And so, were you nervous when you decided like, this is really the direction I want to go? And then I'm also curious, is now that you've been in the space, are you finding, more and more people are discovering you and what you're doing?
Yeah, to give you a frame of reference in terms of timeline, it took me about 1.5 years to transition from the messaging I was using previously to what I have now, and to begin seeing that work for me, because I was in a vortex caught within the same ideal client. So they would refer their friends who looked like them and thought like them to me, and they were paying me, and they're paying me well. And so it's hard to say no to the money when you have bills to pay as an adult. And that's what made me really nervous. It was less about what will they think of me, and more of, will I be able to continue paying my bills because I'm making this huge shift in my life? And the answer was unequivocally yes, I was going to be fine because I did it incrementally, right? So like, I did not say, if you're white, I won't work with you, leave my business. It was, I'm going to step by step attract the right people and then work with them and eventually replace all of the people I used to work with who I want to work with now. So it was an incremental, slow change. And that's what I would recommend to anybody looking to totally shift their business or their career even. You just want to take your time as an adult, especially if you have more privilege and you're like, supported by other people, you have what, I don't know, a trust fund, you have different options. But for like the average person, incremental progress is, I feel like, the best and safest solution here.
Yeah, and so let's talk about today in terms of what kind of work you're doing. So who are some of your clients, and what are some of the ways in which you're helping give voice to their narratives?
Yeah, so we separate our client roster into two buckets. 70% must be someone from an historically excluded population. So that could be LGBTQIA+, neurodiverse, disabled, or BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. The other 30% I allocate to advocates and allies of the cause. And you have to be vocal advocates and allies of the cause. You can't just say you are, right? I want to see actual action. And once I have these buckets, I'm able to say, okay, now I want authors and entrepreneurs in this space. Some of them, for example, are DEI consultants, so diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants. And they've written a book that they want to promote to new audiences. So that's an example of one of my clients. Another one might be Victoria Albina. She's a functional medicine nurse practitioner who just has a really cool social justice lens on how we can approach wellness in our world today and how we can offer more accessible resources for under-resourced people who maybe have chronic illnesses, who the traditional medical system rejects or doesn't offer access to. And so that's another example of a client that I love working with, because I think my clients just have amazing solutions for those who are usually excluded from our typical systems.
Yeah, and why, in your experience, or just sort of your point of view, why do you think there are groups that have had problems getting their stories or their voices heard?
Yeah, Temple, this is a large systemic issue.
It's a very big question, I know.
But if I could give you maybe a taste of what happens in the media specifically. So the model minority myth is one that we might be familiar with, considering the recent anti-Asian sentiment that's been happening in the news and in the larger public overall. So the model minority myth says that Asians are able to take their bootstraps and overcome all of the systemic oppression at their doorsteps and be successful, and that they are a standout minority in America, like they're their American dream. And while that does place Asians in a positive light, it also pits Asians against other minority groups. And it reinforces this idea that we have to have a proximity to whiteness to be acceptable, valuable, or to benefit society, right? So there are all these insidious pieces within this myth that have been disseminated across our medias to help reinforce it, right? So someone decided this is what we need to reinforce. We're going to put it in movies. We're going to put it on the news. We're going to tell stories of Asians overcoming the odds so that people realize that this is what is good and acceptable and what we need to strive for, right? So they're using the media to achieve this aim. On the flip side, we can use the media to tell whole stories, right? That's a singular story about Asians. You are good because you overcame the odds. And that misses out the nuance of so many of the full Asian experience, of the full Asian American experience. And it tokenizes them, right? You're only good if you do this. So that's an idea of how, because they decided that this is an area we want to tell. It's reinforced in the media. Asians begin to believe it themselves. And then like we can't get out of this. We have to unlearn this narrative that we were taught in order to see, oh, we are valuable beyond this belief. We can do other things besides be doctors. Right? There's all of these ideas. It limits our idea of who we are and our perspective. And that's one way that we see the systemic barriers happening in the media.
Yeah, and you mentioned, that idea of a single story, and I know you're familiar. There's a fantastic TED Talk for everybody. You should just Google it, the single story, dangers of a single story, or something like that, which is exactly this. When you just get one narrative, that's what you think about the group, when all of us are much more complex than that. And I'm curious if you've seen, even the last year or two, change in your work in terms of like even just the receptiveness of people you reach out to in terms of having more inclusivity in the voices that are being heard.
I would say that there definitely is more attention on the problem, which is always a good step to take. There is still an issue with diversity in the newsrooms, right? So all of you out there who come from diverse backgrounds, who want to be journalists, please be journalists so that we can tell full diverse stories, because publicists like me need buy-in from journalists like you to work together to tell these important stories. Because if we don't have diversity in the newsroom, we can't connect our diverse clients with what's happening overall in the media. So I think that's a huge problem that we're seeing being addressed now, especially in the realm of investigative reporting. We need more diversity there, especially.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit about your own background? Because you are, when we think about the single story of defining people, it tends to put people in this like singular boxes, when that's not how we tend to be. So you have Black and Taiwanese background, you're female, you're American. There are a lot of different things intersecting to make Cher. So can you just sort of talk about that idea and how does that influence your own work or what you're doing?
Yeah, so I am first generation. That's important, right? I'm the first child that was born on American soil. My mother was an immigrant. That's a huge story that flavors my entire narrative. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm cisgender, right? I am Taiwanese and Black. And I grew up, this is, I think, an important piece of the story that's not often told. I grew up in a very small railroad town in southern Michigan, where I was one of two Asian families. I think there were maybe 3 Asian kids in my elementary school. So that created a lot of racist experiences for me, because they didn't know how to talk. They didn't understand what it meant to be different. And so, children are children, and parents, especially in that area, don't know how to talk to the children about different races. So I would say identity-wise, that's a huge part of my story. And then I left Michigan to move to Las Vegas, which is crazy diverse, and experience this whole new world of what color could look like and how different backgrounds could be. And then, of course, chose to move back to a small white town in Eastern Washington to raise my daughter, who is now half white, half Taiwanese.
Yeah. One of the things that I've heard you mention in another interview is the idea that everyone has their own diversity story. And so I'm curious what you meant by that, if you could share a little bit.
Yeah, so this comes from my client, Jennifer Brown. She has an incredible book called How to Be an Inclusive Leader. It's right over here. And her fundamental belief is that it doesn't matter what you look like. You could be upper middle class, white, male, you still have a diversity story. Maybe you know somebody in your family who's autistic, right? Who has a neurodiversity. Maybe you have a friend who is in a wheelchair, right? Who's not able-bodied, right? So even though you might have all of these factors in your life, you do have diversity around you. And it's not just diversity of color, right? We have diversity of intersectional diversity of all these different kinds of diversities. So when you dig deep into your story, what other pieces of diversity have touched your life and how has that impacted you?
Yeah. And one of the things that I was curious to hear your view on is, you mentioned there's a lot more awareness of the problem. And so I think there are a lot of companies who present themselves as caring a lot about diversity and equity and inclusion and things like that. So I'm curious, how do you think organizations can actually show that the message is authentic and not just they're doing it because they know they should be doing it?
They need to embed their values within their operations and their company culture first, right? You got to start at home before you can really deliver an authentic message. This is part of the reason why I said, if I'm going to serve diverse leaders, I need my own diverse network. And if I don't have one, how authentic is that to my credibility? And so, companies have a lot of moving parts. They're big, complex organizations, and it requires a lot of internal work to see the change be translated externally. And a good example of what you can do in the meantime while you're doing this deep work is an example of like the 15% pledge, right? Where this organization is asking companies to commit 15% of their shelf space to Black-owned companies, to Black-owned founders. And so we're able to see diversity in product increase in places like Target or Walmart or Macy's on a very tangible, real level. And those are amazing initiatives to commit to and to continue being accountable to as well.
Yeah, I mean, what prompted that question, or what I was thinking about this week as I was thinking about our conversation, was like the news coming out of the NFL, which externally seems very committed to social justice and things like that. But then internally, it seems they're very comfortable with conversations that are the opposite of what they're putting externally. So that's what kind of made me think is, how do we, as an organization, what I liked about you saying is it starts, with the organization itself to actually demonstrate that commitment.
Yeah, and do you actually, I've been following that story, but I don't know what prompted them to search through his emails. And I loved it. I thought, oh my gosh, what accountability to demonstrate that, yes, we really do care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we're going to search through your emails just to see how accountable you were, to see how you behaved over time, and then to actually take action. And he resigned, but
Right.
I'm sure he was encouraged to resign.
Yes, yeah, and I saw somebody tweet as a joke, obviously, that there were probably a lot of NFL owners who are contacting their IT people to learn about how long emails are kept and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Switching gears, so I want to go back in time now a little bit to college to kind of get to where you are now. So if we go back to college, were you always interested in PR? Is that what you were studying? What did your college experience look like?
Yeah, I was a business major first. And then I took an accounting class and realized that I was not fit to be a business major. And I thought, maybe communications. And I fell in love with rhetoric. I thought it was one of the coolest, most accessible and translatable skills into the real world, but didn't ever see myself as a publicist. I didn't even really know what a publicist was or did, or that I could ever be one. I more thought that I'd be a journalist first. I'm a writer by trade. And so I thought, I'll just write really cool stories and I'll be that person, maybe travel stories, because I was like around the time Italy became important to my life. And then I was offered an internship by an adjunct professor who was writing her own book and creating her own side business as a career coach. And she said, I noticed you in class. I love your papers. I love your writing. Would you consider this internship? And at the time I thought, like, why not? What else am I doing? So I gave it a try. And she taught me the basics of public relations before I knew what that meant. So it was how to amass a media list, how to customize templates for pitches, and how to cold call producers. Because this is the time, I'm older than I look, I'm sure. This is the time when cold calling people was acceptable for public relations. It is no longer okay. But we used to role play what a producer cold call might look like. And so I would get up at 4 a.m. in Las Vegas to pitch producers at 7 a.m. their time in New York City. And I was floored that we were able to land incredible features on NBC and CNN in New York City for someone who was virtually unknown and who was self-publishing a book. And I thought, oh my God, you could just ask people to put you on TV and they will. Like, this is incredible. And so I took those skills and I translated it into my next venture, which is more of a freelance project where I worked with an online entrepreneur to help her land sponsorships for her podcast.
Awesome. And then you got that. And so what were your next steps to building, to eventually getting to start your own PR agency?
Funny enough, I used the Iceberg Project, which is my Italian website, as a playground for online business. I thought, I really love what I do with Italian, and I'm learning all of these interesting like online business skills. What if I merged the two and then, waited to see what happened? And that was a great place for me to just like fail a lot and to learn a lot about what doesn't work with online business. In fact, I'm rebranding the whole Italian site now because I made so many mistakes initially. And that experience with my own business and with working with online entrepreneurs helped me see a path forward for how I could use my unique skill set to help people who wanted to promote their messages and their books and their services within niche communities. And so I began then to offer podcast pitching specifically to entrepreneurs, and then was able within, I think, a year or 2 years to pull back in my traditional PR services. So that's pitching publications, TV or radio, or speaking gigs sometimes as well, as additional services to new clients.
Awesome. Well, since you brought up the podcast, let's talk about that, because I think there are a lot of students who'd probably be interested in starting their own podcast or learning more about that. And we won't get into like the technical elements of it, but so you love Italy, you've learned Italian. Where did the idea of I'm going to start a podcast to teach Italian, how did that come to be?
When I look back at like 21-year-old Cher, I'm like, wow, that was kind of arrogant to think that like, I'm not a native speaker. I don't have any Italian heritage. Like, what was I really thinking? I'm so glad that I wasn't thinking about it, because I wouldn't have done it, right? It's a scary thing to be so visible and to be so open to criticism as someone who doesn't speak Italian fluently, or didn't then. I had a mentor who this was 2012. So podcasting was just starting to take off within our industry. And she said, hey, you have this like cool website. Why don't you start a podcast for it? And I thought, okay, let me just do this and see what happens. And I remember the first week that I launched, I had 6 downloads, and I was like, who downloaded these episodes? Like, who are these people, these 6 people who like want to listen to what I have to say? And I honestly, I barreled forward. I thought, okay, if I just published once a week for a year, if nothing happens, nothing happens, and there's no harm lost, right? I'm still learning Italian. I'm still doing what I want to do. And if it works, then great, then I'm building an audience. And to date, it is the #1 like referral generation lead for people to find me, like yourself.
Yeah, and so the Iceberg Project, the website came first. That was before the podcast. Okay, and then, how did you find it? Did it grow slowly? Like how did the podcast grow over that first year when you're trying to put them out once a week?
Yeah, so we were at 6 downloads the first week of launch. I think in the next month we had a couple hundred. And then honestly, back then the iTunes, the Apple podcast algorithm was so favorable to niche podcasts. There weren't any other podcasts that taught Italian, especially by a non-native speaker. So I think maybe I was like one of 10, and that search engine really like benefited me. So it was easy enough for people to say Italian in the podcast to find me. And so I think within maybe 6 months, we had, I don't know, a few thousand downloads. And there was at some point, I don't know if it was a year, or if it was 2 years after, I was like, oh, we passed 1 million downloads. Like, this is insane. And now to date, we have millions of downloads. And I don't publish a podcast anymore. Like, wait, I ended it at 200 episodes, which was a lot, because it does take a lot of time to produce a podcast.
Yeah, and so as you're doing that, are you figuring out, how do you monetize? 1,000 downloads, 10,000 downloads. Are you just sort of figuring that out as you go?
So bringing this full circle, when the podcast was active, I used all of my PR skills to land sponsorships for myself. So I would approach language learning companies who had my target listener, and I would say, hey, I have this many downloads. I have this credibility. Would you be interested in partnering with me? So not only do I get like the product for free, which I appreciated using, but also I get paid to do pre-roll ads, mid-roll ads, and closing ads for all of my episodes. And I felt very professional saying things like Quizlet is sponsoring this episode of a 30-minute Italian podcast. So that was a very cool full circle way that I could see my PR skills coming to use. And now we have a full suite of digital products on the website. So we don't actually need sponsorships. We just sell our own products.
Cool. And I'll bridge this into what I know you're doing now, which is, you mentioned before we started broadcasting, starting a YouTube channel. And so can you just quickly tell us about what's that going to be, and maybe what lessons you've learned from podcasting that you're applying to launching this?
Yeah, I think any kind of content creation teaches you how to choose topics that others will find inherently interesting. I've had to retitle a lot of the original blog posts for the Iceberg Project because they were like clunky and confusing and didn't really say what I wanted them to say. So it's taught me a lot about how to title things appropriately, right? How to choose topics that resonate with other people, and how to create short form and long form content that keeps people engaged, because it is a challenge to keep people watching a video instead of clicking away to something else, right? So Italian with Cher is the new brand for the Iceberg Project. Makes sense. It's what it should have been originally in terms of a branding lesson. And I will be doing vlog-like videos to help people see what it's like to learn Italian from someone who doesn't live in the country, right? You don't have to live in Italy to learn Italian well, I don't think. From someone who runs a business full-time and who has a 7-month-old baby, right? I have all these constraints and still I'm able to fit Italian into my life. And so what does that look like?
Awesome. And we have a question from Donna. Buongiorno, Donna. She is asking, when building your business, what is something you know now that you wish you knew when you started?
On the list of 50 things, let me try to choose one. I made so many mistakes. There is one that's coming up for me most recently, which is to follow my own curiosity, right? To trust in my own curiosity above what other people say are best practices in business. So instead of saying, this is what you should be doing, stopping and reassessing, well, what do I want to be doing? Like, what feels fun for me? Because at the end of the day, we're building these businesses for ourselves, right? I wanted a lifestyle business so I could live first and work second. And I have to stay true to that guiding light if I really want to enjoy my work to the fullest.
And another question I had, because you mentioned the name of the YouTube, which is Italian with Cher, makes sense. I'm curious about, so we've got the Iceberg Project, we've got Gingko PR, we have Italian with Cher. Can you speak a little bit about those names, not the Italian with Cher, but that's an obvious one, but either Iceberg Project to start with, because names are important, right? There's a lot of intentionality. And then also Gingko PR, where did that name come from in terms of why you chose it?
Yeah, so all of my names are steeped in deep symbolism and metaphor because this is who I am as a person. The Iceberg Project came from me sitting in my intercultural comms class in Italy and being introduced to this theory of the iceberg, right? When you come to a new country, you see the tip of the iceberg. You see what they're wearing, what they eat, how they sound, maybe a few words. But it isn't until you go underneath the water to that large mass of the iceberg that you're able to truly understand a new culture, right? You're able to get what are their values? Why do they behave the way they do? What drives their decisions? And that's what I wanted. I wanted the language to be a bridge to that large mass beneath the water so that I could truly feel and think like an Italian. That's the Iceberg Project's name. Then Gingko PR, I really love the story of summer of 1945. The US dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And they were told after by scientists that nothing would grow there for maybe a decade, that it was going to be barren land. And then 8 short months later, they saw buds coming from from a collection of ginkgo trees in this plaza that was heavily bombed. And that symbolism to me was so powerful. I thought, how resilient is nature and how resilient are we to be able to be oppressed for as long as we have and continue to tell our stories and thrive in the face of opposition.
That is beautiful. I never heard that story. Something I was thinking as you're talking about the iceberg name, just to connect everything for you, this just kind of blew my mind, is the iceberg in a lot of ways goes back to the single story, right? The tip of the iceberg is the single story, and then underneath the water is actually the full reality of whether we're individuals, countries, people, and things like that. So I'm just connecting some things there for you.
So have I always been walking this path? It seems like it.
Yeah, you're finding it, and you know, and it evolves over time. So going back to Ginkgo PR and amplifying these stories of marginalized communities, for people who are just starting out in PR, who may be working for a larger agency or working for someone, what advice do you have? How do you think people can incorporate that perspective into either just their lives more broadly or even just everyday working life?
So the perspective of telling whole stories.
And being an advocate, an ally, and telling those whole stories, yeah.
Again, broken record, we have to start our own work at home, right? So how are we personally and individually committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion? We have to answer that question for ourselves first, and we have to bring those beliefs into our daily routines and our daily actions. And once we're able to do that, I would say within larger agencies, having never worked in an agency, but knowing the environments that it can foster, this can be difficult. It can be difficult to ethically pitch and hold true to your values because you don't get to choose your clients, right? Especially as a junior or entry level publicist. And there are beautiful, incredible values-led companies and agencies that you can work for instead. So you can work in-house as a publicist for a socially conscious brand. And anyway, in-house publicists are the best publicist jobs because everyone wants what you have, as opposed to being in an agency where you're asking people to give you things. It's just a different dynamic as a power dynamic. So there's that. And then there are companies that work primarily with climate forward businesses, for example, or there are agencies that only work with socially conscious brands. And so you can try to apply and find space within those agencies. And if you're hoping to do freelance instead, like I did in the beginning of my career, you're able to create your own ethos and choose your clients based on what you believe in so that you can control more of the process. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're thinking about Ginkgo, what are like just to get a little bit specific for people who are learning PR, what are some of the tactics? Like, what are your common ways? So if someone says, I've got this book, about inclusive leadership, what's your next step? Like, what are your strategies for trying to get the word out there?
Yeah, you have to intimately understand the message first. So I will read the book cover to cover. I will listen to pretty much anything the person has ever said, the author's ever said or written, just so I have a really comprehensive understanding of who they are and their message now. And then I talk to them. What's your vision moving forward? What are you going to be known for? If you are a thought leader for X thing, what is that? And how can we find the ideal outlets that we can pitch so that you're in front of the right people, right? You don't want to pitch everybody. You want to pitch only the right audiences. And then I want to identify who is her target listener or client or customer so that when we develop the messages that we develop, they speak directly to their experience, right? They're resonating with those people first. And once we have that foundation set, I'm able to start pitching those outlets, right? I've created this media list based on my research that speak to those target listeners. I pitch journalists, editors, producers, podcast hosts, everyone who makes media within the space. And I introduce the messages based on my understanding of their platform. So I say, given your interest in XYZ, Jennifer Brown could speak on these topics. Does any of that fit within your upcoming content calendar? Thanks for your time.
Yeah, and are there, thinking about the last couple of years, are there any of your clients that you're particularly like proud of, like, a particularly successful piece of PR work that you did where you were really able to get their message out there?
Yeah, so I have a client who was a couple, Chris Marie Campbell and Susan Clark, and they are an LGBTQIA plus couple out of Whitefish, Montana. And they wrote a book called The Beauty of Conflict for Couples. And what I love most about working with them is not only are they brilliant and kind and have a great media presence, but that the stories we pitched were never about them being a gay couple, right? I was able to pitch their stories and land pieces on the Today Show, my first ever Today Show mention from them. And they were valuable in their own merit for their information, for their expertise, rather than being tokenized for one of their labels.
Cool. I just wrote down that I'm writing notes because I'm like, that book sounds awesome. I know. I feel like that speaks to us. And then I'm curious on like the flip side of that, has there ever been a client where you just love so much the message and you're just not gaining the traction and you're like wanting to bang your head around because you know it's such a great message?
This actually reminds me of what so many of us do, is that we fall in love with the potential of a person rather than the person present day. I think many of us have made this mistake with past partners. And I have done the same thing with past clients where I fell in love with the potential of their message rather than what they were presenting to me, telling me the truth of what they had offered today. So maybe their branding was not quite where it needed to be, right? They didn't have a presence for the media that had been developed enough to really communicate what they had to offer. Or they were just too strapped for time and resources to really devote their efforts fully. And so there definitely have been a few disappointing campaigns that I've worked on where I thought, man, if only I could have done more, I could have helped them succeed. That was my mindset, but it's not true. The truth is that if I had vetted them better, I could have referred them to the correct next step rather than trying to make up for all of the areas where they weren't ready yet.
Yeah. And then as you've navigated this path that we've been talking about, looking ahead, so we know we've got the YouTube show coming out. What other things, like where do you see yourself? We'll just say 5 years as a nice round number. Like where do you hope Gingko grows? Like what's your vision for the next phase of your life?
Well, in 5 years, Kiara, who's my daughter, will be almost 6, which means we can go back to Italy. We can travel to Europe finally, because we can't now. So I will hopefully be somewhere in Tuscany or on a beach in Sicily, um, on vacation from the PR agency, thinking about how much I love working with my socially conscious, values-driven clients who are changing the face of our media landscape, right? We're telling stories still that create a more equitable media landscape. And I'm hoping as well that I can introduce some kind of a sliding cost option for all of my clients, right? Where some, like the advocates and allies, pay full price so that I can offer a lower cost for my other clients who have incredible stories and are ready for the media, but don't quite have the resources to bring that, to afford my services. So I would love to do that. And I'd love to help influence the next generation of publicists to like have a more ethical perspective for what PR can do with the right skill set, how we can use PR to change our world in the ways that we want to.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, you're rebranding PR in general, because PR has a bad rep, but you're saying, no, PR can actually be the catalyst for change. And it's not just the companies trying to sell you lies.
Yeah, I always joke that public relations needs its own publicist.
And then, and Donna's question sort of touched on this, but if you think back to you as a college student, this journey that you've been on, what are, any of the important lessons, or what advice do you have for people as they're beginning a career, or really, shifting careers, or at any point in their lives?
I think that we have more room than ever to try a lot of different things. So even if you think, maybe journalism and you try it and you hate it, to continue trying other areas within the comms industry to see what fits for you and to talk to lots of people. I think mediums like this are so helpful because immediately someone could say, oh, I thought I wanted to have my own agency, but hearing Cher's experience, I don't actually want that. Right. And we're able to save ourselves a lot of time and effort and pain by listening to others' experiences. So I would say just take in all the information that you can about what you think you want to do so that you can create your own, you can carve out your own path for yourself.
Yeah, fabulous. And then my last question, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, because I could go all day, is, of course, just since I'm the host, I get to bring it back to Italy. What is your favorite Italian dish? Because I'll bring it back to both Italy and food, but the two things I love most. So what's your favorite Italian dish, or even Italian food memory of being there?
My favorite dish is a Roman dish, and Rome is like my city in terms of like what I feel I can just do. And it's cacio e pepe, which is like a cheese and pepper dish, and it's like a thick, creamy white sauce. It's incredible. I can't make it. I've tried to make this dish so many times, and I fail every time.
And what's crazy, and I've not tried this, Trader Joe's now has that in their frozen foods. Yeah, and I haven't tried it yet. I don't frozen pasta. I don't know. I just feel like there are limits.
It's a TJ,
but
though.
I saw that. And I'm like, I can't believe that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very famous Roman dish.
What about you? I have to ask now.
Oh gosh, I love just about anything in a sage butter sauce. But I love yeah, a fresh tortellini or something like that, in a very simple sauce. I don't make homemade pasta often, but I'm actually making it tonight for dinner. So we'll
Godspeed.
we'll see how it works out. But I just want to thank you so much for taking this time out of your day to speak about this, because I think it's the work that you're doing is so inspirational and important. And so I'm really glad that we got to have this conversation and hear more about what you did and your story of how you got there.
Yeah, it was a total pleasure. And if any student watches this now or later and has questions for me, feel free to include my email so they can reach out personally.
Awesome, I will, and I'll share, links to your website and LinkedIn and things like that in the follow-up email. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your Friday, and we'll be connected soon. Thanks everybody for joining. Bye.